All right, welcome everybody to GitOps the Planet. I am your host as always. My name is Dan Garfield. I am the Chief Open Source Officer and co-founder of a wonderful company called CodeFresh, where we make CI/CD and continuous delivery dreams happen for everyone, all of our users. For those of you that don't know me, I am an Argo maintainer. I'm also a co-creator of the Open GitOps standard and the GitOps working group underneath the CNCF. Pretty exciting times we're living in right now. Lots going on, and everybody's trying to sprinkle AI fairy dust into their stuff. If you didn't catch last week's, it was a week before stream, where we talked about Kate's GPT and AI with DevOps. Go check that episode out. It's on YouTube currently. And of course, next week, we're going to have on Kit Merker, who was the original product manager on Kubernetes, He's going to be on talking with us about creating SLOs, service level objectives, and how that works. But I'm a person who likes to live in the present. So we're going to be showing off today the wonderful, amazing, fantastic Kat Cosgrove, who has been recently doing quite a bit of work with CI/CD. And our topic today is ditching old and busted CI/CD with Kat Cosgrove. So without further ado, Kat, welcome to GitOps the Planet.
Hello.
I'm going to go back to this
Happy to be here.
So, Kat, I gave a very brief intro where I just said you're wonderful and amazing. But do you want to maybe give an intro for people who don't know who you are?
Sure. So I'm a lead developer.
5 of them who are left.
Yeah. So I'm a lead developer advocate at Dell, but I've kind of been around in the DevOps space for a minute. I used to work at Pulumi, an infrastructure as code company. And I also used to work at JFrog. I worked there as a developer advocate when they released their CI/CD tool, but originally I was an embedded Linux developer there, which is fun. But I've been on the Kubernetes release team for the last several releases. I think this one is my 7th consecutive release, which does get exhausting. You're supposed to take breaks.
Is it easier working on Kubernetes releases than it was working on embedded Linux?
Different problems. As a release team member, it's a lot of herding cats, right? It's a lot of making sure that code and documentation contributors are in the right places at the right times and they meet their deadlines. We just had the docs deadline yesterday. Actually, it was midnight on the 25th. But embedded Linux development was a lot of screaming into a pillow. Yeah.
I get you. Yeah. With Argo, it's the same way. I mean, I help out on some of the releases here and there, and it's mostly just, for me, my part is just talking to people, checking in with, hey, what's going on with this feature? What's going on with that bug? When's this going to be done? What are we thinking? Can we get somebody else to work on this? You know, that kind of stuff. So I definitely empathize with that. And now you've done a lot of work in the past with artifact management, of course, and kind of DevOps as a process. So what made you, I was actually wondering, you gave this presentation on the history of CI/CD, and I thought it was very interesting and good. For those that haven't seen it, definitely look it up. It's on YouTube, just Kat Cosgrove, history of CI/CD. What led you to put that together? What was the inspiration to start doing that kind of work?
I had a suspicion that tools today are not as difficult as they seem to be. Like they certainly are difficult to use. There's absolutely a learning curve to any piece of new technology, but I found that every time I tried like a new class of tool, if I didn't immediately understand the why for that tool, then I had a harder time grasping it. And in order to understand the why for that tool, I would go look at, okay, like how do you accomplish this without this abstraction layer? How do you go automate a software development lifecycle without a CI/CD tool? What does that look like? And the answer is you kind of can't. But to the whole process done manually is miserable, So it was a series of that, with not just CI/CD, but with functionally every new class of tool I try now. I go look at like, okay, how do I accomplish this goal, this task without this type of tool? And then I understand the pain points that exist without that tool. And it makes learning the new thing a little bit easier. You inherently grasp it a little bit better if you can understand the pain points that it's solving. But if you don't have the experience of doing something without a tool that makes it easier, then things like Terraform or Argo CD can seem very, very difficult.
Yeah.
And not that there isn't still a learning curve. There absolutely is. Nobody should feel bad about like struggling to learn a new tool. But when you just immediately grasp, oh, this is what this is trying to solve for me. I hated doing that. I get it now. You can understand some of the trade-offs made, and it gets a little bit easier to use. the actual history of CI/CD talk, that was because I cannot resist a rabbit hole. So once I went and looked at like what CI/CD tools looked like before I started using them, my first CI/CD tool was Travis CI.
Yeah,
Uh,
a lot of people's. Yeah.
yeah. Once I started looking older than that, I was like, geez, I don't think that a lot of the people I'm talking to at conferences are aware of exactly how old this type of tool is and what its predecessors looked like. And what I found is that, yeah, like pretty universally, developers under the age of like 50 don't know what the history of these kinds of tools look like. And increasingly, 50 and older year old developers are the minority. So it's a
What was
fun.
the earliest tool that you found in your history?
So the earliest one for CI/CD specifically, like in the talk, I go into like when continuous integration was like first posited as an idea, and that's not a tool, right? It's just an idea. But the first coining of the term was 1991, Grady
Wow.
Booch in object-oriented analysis and design. So in that one, he coins the term continuous integration, and all he did was suggest that we push updates more often, right? He wasn't suggesting releasing like multiple times a day the way we kind
Yeah,
of
right.
think of it now. But from there, it became extreme programming, and from there, it became agile. But the first earliest like open source tool I found was cruise control.
Oh,
Um, and giving that talk is fun because I try to like have the little logo up for the tool I'm talking about. But cruise control is so old and it hasn't been updated in or like there hasn't been a new release in so long that there aren't PNG versions of the logo for cruise control with like a background transparency
right.
because it was last updated before that feature was supported by browsers. Yeah.
That's pretty
So
good. Well, 1991 is not so bad. I thought you were going to say, well, back in the Roman times, they stapled a bunch of abacuses together, and they had a way of doing it. But 1991 is not so bad. I guess source
that's
code
not bad.
management, I think, only goes back to like the 70s. So it makes sense
Yeah.
that there would be. I was actually surprised how long there is between source code management being created and CI/CD being created. But
Yep.
I like what you were saying about wanting to understand, like, okay, what does this look like without this tool? Because it's like a first principles approach to technology, and that instinct to call something hard really generally comes from not understanding how hard it was before, how hard
Yeah.
the alternative was. When people talk about how hard Kubernetes is, they're like, oh, and it's been very much of fashion lately to dump on Kubernetes and Kubernetes, it's set the whole industry back. Oh, it's wasting everybody's time. Oh, it's a nightmare. Da, 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 da.
Yeah.
And I always, yeah, Kubernetes is hard. It's just way easier than the alternative to accomplish the same things. Doing this stuff
Yep.
manually, doing this stuff, building your own servers. And I remember at Atlassian, we had to build a data center product that was basically set up in such a way that we could do replication for Jira and
Mhm.
stuff. And that was, a year-long effort to put together that product and then release it. And it was a huge,
Yep.
huge effort. Doing it with Kubernetes, kind of way easier than building
It
our
is
own.
way easier. And like I actually recently wrote a talk on the history of virtualization.
Oh,
And that one is like a very, very long story. That one goes back to like the 60s. And looking at what life was like when we didn't have containers and how hard it was for us to just figure out how to like virtualize memory. Like
that's
it's
a real problem.
yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, having that perspective is it's helpful when you're learning something new, but also it's just kind of like fun to learn,
Yeah.
you know?
Well, it's like Kubernetes the hard way.
Yeah.
One of the best ways to learn that whole setup is to do Kubernetes the hard way, where you go and you learn every single piece and what it's doing and why it's doing it.
Yep.
And you're like, oh yeah, you know what? It's actually really nice. I don't have to handle leader election as part of my services now. This is just handled for me. This is a lot of pain that is removed that I don't have to worry about anymore. So yeah, with CI/CD, it is interesting because I think a lot of people, most modern people got their start either using Jenkins or if they were doing something on-prem, or using Travis CI if they were doing something cloud-based. Of course, Travis CI is basically gone now. I think it still exists, but it got bought by somebody and kind of shut down and rolled into something else or whatever.
They had like a little bit of a mishap with killing open source accounts a year and a half, 2 years ago or something, and I just kind of heard nothing about them after that.
Well, and of course now GitHub Actions has really taken over on the open source front.
Right.
And I thought for a little while, oh well, CodeFresh, we should actually be the CI/CD for the open source stuff, but the market didn't actually quite make sense because we're really focused on CI/CD for microservices, for Kubernetes. And so we have all these great superpowers for working with Kubernetes services, but most open source projects, they're not running Kubernetes and they're not running their own services. So they don't necessarily, they need to run Kubernetes maybe for testing, like for Argo, it makes sense. But for other projects, it doesn't make sense. So it didn't quite make sense for us to be oriented that way. Though we do have open source option, and you can use it for open source, and you can make your builds public, just like you would with anything else. So it does work, but it doesn't.
It's not the focus.
It's not the focus, and it's not where it's not our it's not the focus. Yeah, that's good. So with what you've seen in kind of the history of CI/CD, do you feel? I feel like people are still living in the past, and that a lot of people are still using. Thankfully, they're not using. Was it autopilot or what was it called?
Some people absolutely still are using cruise control, which is an unfortunate thing that I found out when writing that talk. Some people do absolutely still use cruise control, which I think sucks for security reasons, right? It hasn't had a new release in more than a decade. And also originally cruise control was like language specific, right? So you would have to be using like the Ruby variant of cruise control or the Java variant of cruise control. But generally, I do think that like from a functional, like just how you interact with it perspective, CI/CD has stayed like relatively static as a class of tool for a while. Like every once in a while, there have been like incremental changes, such as introducing like a graphical type of interface for CI/CD. You saw this with JFrog pipelines, did that. I don't know that is actually like super useful personally. I've always found it like far more confusing to use that than just writing some YAML or some Python or something. But I do think that by and large, just from a how you interact with it perspective, CI/CD has not changed much in a while. And I also don't think that that's a bad thing. Like PlayStation controllers have also been basically the same for decades, but they also kind of nailed it the first time. So
well, that's true. I actually like this analogy a lot, because if you look at a PlayStation 1 controller and what are we up to, 5 now?
5,
PlayStation 5 controller, we are like, oh, these are kind of the same looking thing. Once you got DualShock, they look the same. But if you actually go and try to use a PlayStation 1 controller, you will be, I actually pulled mine out the other day. I was showing my kids my whole old game collection, and we run some PS1 games on an emulator. We had a little retro box going so we can play those games. But and we use like an Xbox controller now to play that stuff. But if you actually pick up and try to use, first of all, it weighs like 1 ounce, and you're like, where's the rest of the controller? Like, what is, this is just air.
Empty plastic.
And then when you try to actually use it, it's like, oh, these buttons don't feel great. And like the
plastic is like a weird texture.
Yes. Like, everything is not good. When you pick up a new one, it is like mind blowing how much better it is, even though the format is essentially the same. And I think CI/CD format, it's like, hey, I've got a set of steps that I need to run. I have a flow. I need to run a build. Maybe I need to make a container. I need to push it somewhere. I need to test it. That's been the same forever. But
Mhm.
the actual
User experience, like
yeah, the
the
user
bells and
experience
whistles.
is pretty dramatically different. And I think because we have a lot of users who are still migrating from Jenkins, right, to
Mm,
CodeFresh. And I get a little hate because I kind of dumped on Jenkins a bit, maybe overzealously or early on in CodeFresh. But they do notice a pretty big difference when they're like, oh yeah, like I don't have to like write my own caching system now. Like that's nice. Gosh, that saves me a lot of time. And like,
yeah,
oh, like the like passing stuff between containers, it's like that modern controller where suddenly it's like, oh, this is a way better like this is actually more enjoyable. I'm
yeah.
saving a lot of time, even though the structure of this thing isn't that
It's
much different.
basically the same. I think that's pretty much what's happened with CI/CD. Like we nailed the concept, and
Yeah.
now we're improving the usability, the user experience, the nice to haves, the quality of life features that come with it.
Yeah,
You
I mean
know?
it's like cars. Like cars are in structure kind of the same that
Yeah,
they've been for 80 years, but driving a car that's 10 years old is a very different experience than driving a car that's brand new. I think
yeah.
these are pretty good analogies that you've brought. So I do notice like even some of the best practices I am kind of baffled by a little bit because so for example, I noticed that most people don't run their binary builds inside of
Mm,
Docker files, which is kind of how I always do it. I just make my Docker file. I'm shipping containers, so I don't
right.
need a binary anyway. Like I don't need just a binary by itself. I just want to ship a container
The
fully
container.
formed.
Yeah.
So I almost always do my builds inside of my containers, and this allows me to take advantage of some of the caching mechanisms, things like that. But most people don't. Most people have their CI process, they build their binary, and then they add it, their Docker file consumes the binary that they already built. And
Interesting.
I don't know. I think it makes sense if you're shipping a binary for people to consume.
Yeah.
But if you're only shipping a container, I think that people are doing that by accident. Like I don't think that they thought through the fact that they're only shipping a container, that they should just build it into their Docker file.
Yeah, that might just be like a I hate that I'm using this word in this context in this conversation, but that may just be an artifact of like having learned to interact with the CI/CD pipeline before they were using containers, before
Oh
the
yeah.
popularity of containers and microservices. It may just be like a holdover
Oh
kind
yeah.
of type
I think
thing. That's my
100%
suspicion.
that's why people do it. I think
Yeah.
it's like when people build a container that when it starts up it downloads something.
Yeah,
That's a total like VM world thing.
it is.
And
That's how I learned how to do it too. But
right?
that was, a decade ago, more than a decade ago at this point. Yeah.
And it saves you building an image, but a lot of the so like I run a Kubernetes home lab, so you can see I've got 3 of the nodes are visible here behind me, and some of the other nodes are over there. But a lot of the container based home lab stuff, and shout out to the episode that we did on Kubernetes at home a few months ago. If people haven't seen that, you should go watch it on YouTube. But most of the images are made for people to run Docker Compose on a single machine. They're not made for Kubernetes.
Right. Yeah.
And as a result, they do a lot of that stuff. They do a lot of stuff that's like, oh, download things on start,
Yeah.
run the latest tag because you don't have to update the compose. And so it's not really designed for people that are running like infrastructure. I want to version things. I want to build a rollback. And so I find myself always having to modify like home lab images to do this stuff. And it makes sense from single machine Docker Compose to home lab. I get it, but it's shockingly common for people to download stuff on container start and to download binaries, latest binaries or whatever, rather than baking
Yeah.
them into images, making them versioned and handling rollbacks. And I think that, I mean, you've seen that probably a ton in the artifact
Have
world.
Yeah, and
Yeah.
also I graduated from a coding boot camp about a decade ago now,
Oh wow!
7
Congratulations.
years ago.
What
Um,
a fantastic career you've had starting in a boot camp. That's amazing.
yeah, but we when we had a very, very small section of the curriculum on Docker and Docker Compose, and it was all like that type of instruction that like you download. So a lot of it is probably just it's that people were taught to do it that way, or they came over from VMs, and that's what makes sense logically to them, but they don't consider that like fundamentally this behaves differently, even though the concept of a container is also super duper old. One of those things we don't think of as being super duper old, but definitely is. So,
well, it's that William Gibson quote: "The future is already here; it's just not evenly distributed." And
yeah,
people are stuck with these things. So this is kind of the topic for us today: is helping people ditch the old and busted. Have you found any success and any advice in helping people figure out like you're actually doing stuff in an old way? You're missing out on these benefits. What have you found, or do people always just how do you keep them from getting defensive over what they've built? This is my baby. I've been running this Jenkins pipeline. I've been nursing it for 10 years. How dare you? You know,
the
have you had any luck?
defensiveness is for sure a problem. The defensiveness is a problem anytime you're trying to get somebody to move off of a tool they love, right? Like, so it's definitely not unique to CI/CD, but yeah, the defensiveness is the biggest hurdle. Actually, it's not like the difficulty of using a new tool; it is the comfort level, right? There, even if I do personally think that Jenkins is difficult to use and like honestly kind of miserable to use, they don't. They're used to it. They took the time and the effort and over probably years of their career to get good at it, and they're very familiar with it, and it's second nature to them at this point. But even in that case where it's second nature to them, there's something that bothers them about it, right? There is always something. So it is a matter of having a friendly conversation to find that. If I'm like actively trying to get somebody to move off of something like Jenkins, which is rare. I don't try to force people off of stuff anymore, because I mean it's also like not my job. Dell doesn't pay me to do that. I never ever bag on whatever their tool of choice is. Like if I'm having a conversation with somebody, I'm never going to tell them, "Hey man, Jenkins sucks. You should not be using this. It is awful. It is making things so much harder for you." Yeah, because like even if those things are true, if you say a bunch of negative things about whatever they love, they're immediately going to shut down, and they're going to think you're mean. And it's just not helpful. So I prefer to try to find out what's bothering them about it, what they think could be improved, because usually these are issues that they're like taking to Jenkins and saying, "Hey, I want this feature." But there's a way to redirect that where you say, "Hey, this feature that you're asking Jenkins for is like bog standard in this other tool, along with these other related quality of life improvements that you might not think you want right now, but you may want in the future." But fortunately, because I am not in any kind of sales position, I don't often like have to have that conversation. When I am talking to somebody about moving to a different solution, they're usually already like interested in looking around, right? So it's an organic conversation at that point.
Well, and I agree with the approach of like, hey, let's talk about what this could look like, rather than focusing on what it does look like, because, we all have things that are great about the current setup that we've made, but, and this is true. I notice of people going to GitOps as well. So a lot of people are right. Like most people are still doing CI/CD pipelines that deploy a VM and they're good. And they may not necessarily understand the benefits of using GitOps right off the bat. And because they're like, well, I know what's running in production. It's like, well, you infer what's running in production, and you assume what's running in production. And they'll, sometimes they'll say like, well, we have a strict rule. Nobody pushes without checking in first. And it's like, that's cool. How do you enforce that? And it's like, oh, well, we just tell people. And it's like, neato. And, I think I've told this story on stream before, but years ago at very famous and well-known financial services company that all of
Are
us.
you going to talk about Knight Capital?
I'm not going to talk about anybody specifically. I'm going to say
Okay.
that we probably have this logo in your wallet, but
Yeah.
this company had laid off a team, and there was an issue with the service that they had been maintaining. And when they went to go and see what was going on, they found that that team hadn't checked any code in for 3 years, and they had literally been pushing and manually updating stuff in production. And so nobody knew it was even running. And so figuring out how to debug that was a nightmare. And so like without like, hey, that's great that you trust your team, trust but verify, right? Like make sure that this is actually the method. And I think GitOps is a lot more than just making sure that code is checked in. I think that there's a lot of advantages to just knowing what's running, having clarity and visibility of what's running, have everybody being able to see that, having a policy, that declaratively states how updates are handled, and if a job needs to be run on an update, and if how you handle a rollback. Having all this stuff declaratively formatted saves a lot of time, and in disaster recovery, it's amazing, right? I had an issue with my cluster recently, and I needed to do a disaster recovery on it, and I ran Argo CD autopilot, repo, bootstrap, recover, and there's everything came back, and it was like, okay, well, that was great. Like downtime, not a problem. I don't care. It's like easier to reboot it.
Yeah, I've said this in, I think, like just about every talk I've ever given on stage, but anytime there is an opportunity for us to like increase reproducibility and reduce the number of things that a human has to touch, especially if it's like a human doing something repetitive and manual, is a good thing, because humans are really, really bad at repetitive manual tasks, and we're not actually that great at remembering stuff either. Whereas the computer, as long as you tell it what to do correctly, is going to do the same thing every time. It is going to do exactly what you tell it to, right? So this is also why I don't like continuous delivery as a term. I'm a team continuous deployment. Automate the button press at the end there. That is a safety blanket. Having a human involved at the end there, that's a safety blanket. That's not security. But yeah, anytime we can get a human out of the equation for a repetitive task, we should. That is not to be interpreted by a soundbite later indicating that I'm in favor of things like Chat GPT, because I extremely am not. But
when you say you're not in favor of Chat GPT, what do you mean? Like, because I'm not in favor of it replacing my relationships, but like,
I think it is. I think it's a fun toy, and I think it's extremely dangerous to use it for anything else. The technology is not there. More importantly, the legislature is not there. We do not have the ability to legislate ChatGPT and the things that it produces and the things that other like large language models produce. We don't have the ability to legislate that. So
if you don't mind the little detour, we'll come back to CI/CD. What does that look like? Because I've used it to help me generate scripts, to help me generate some code, and I've found it to be a huge time saver for me in doing those kinds of tasks. I'm not ready to hand the keys to my car or anything, but like when you say we can't trust it, and I guess I agree. Like I don't trust it in handing the keys over. And we talked a lot about this in the episode that we had with on Kate's GPT. But like, what's your hesitance? Like, what's the worry?
I don't think you should trust anything that comes out of it. Anything that it returns to you, you need to verify what it's returning to you and its sources. It is not difficult to trick it, and it's not difficult to ask it a question that returns data from sources that it made up.
Yeah.
That one's pretty fun. You see that happen a lot with legal cases. There were a couple of lawyers that got in trouble using ChatGPT to produce briefs, and it was returning answers from sources that did not exist, that it wholeheartedly insisted that it didn't exist. And because they didn't check the sources, they got caught for that. So like using it as a starting point for something, like for a scaffold, I think is great, right? That is what it is good for. But using it without supervision, giving like absolutely no oversight, not a single thought to whether or not what it's producing for you is accurate and comes from good sources, that I think is a problem. I also just kind of have an enormous concern about its potential use to replace creative works. I do not like um, that the Writers Guild of America is having to strike to defend themselves from large language models.
Yeah, they're worried about AI creating scripts and things like that, right?
Well, yes, because they've been explicitly told that that's a thing that's going to happen, and they want it codified that that cannot happen, right? SAG is striking over, one of the things they're striking over includes use of AI. But yeah, it's a don't hand the keys over to it type of situation for me. And also don't input proprietary code into it. You know, that feels like a super great way to maybe get fired if you get caught doing that.
Yeah, if you're building, so for example, with Kate's GPT, the way that they've handled hallucinations is basically they have the creativity turned down to zero, and it has it's working off of specific documentation, so it's kind of trained on specific information to answer specific questions. And so when you run Kate's GPT to explain your cluster, it's not really, there's a very low chance of hallucination. I don't know if there's any examples where it's happened, because it basically says, here's the error message you're getting. These are what those error messages mean. Here's links to the documentation. And so it's like, there's not an issue of it from that perspective, but obviously there are bigger moral implications of like, hey, I'm having AI just create a movie for me or something like that. But and that makes sense. But within the context of like helping me code a little bit better, helping me generate scripts.
Sure. Then in that context, it's fine, right? Like, because I mean, before ChatGPT and things like that, I was also using Wolfram Alpha in a sort of similar way to just answer a question for me for math that I didn't feel like doing by hand, right? Or didn't remember how to do. So for those things, no, I think ChatGPT is great. I haven't used Kate's GPT, but if it's one of the things it's good at is explaining to me an error message and sending me to the right place in the docs, that's super useful. That's super duper useful, because the docs can be a little bit like difficult to get through.
They can be hard to understand within the context of your error as well.
Yeah.
And, I think it's like anything else. It's how you use it. It's like, people get mad that when I was a teenager, we played Grand Theft Auto, right? And people were like, oh, in Grand Theft Auto, it's a terrible game because you can do X, Y, and Z. And I was like, I never do that. That sounds terrible. And it's
you
like,
don't
you can do whatever you want. And
I obey traffic laws playing Grand Theft Auto.
Right.
I drive between the lines. I don't speed, and I stop at stoplights and signs. I do.
Yeah, it's choose your own adventure, right? And AI is the same way, where it's like, if you ask it, if you don't give it the right parameters, it's not going to give you the right information out. And I've seen, for example, in the Argo channel, we had people who were, anytime someone would ask a question, somebody would copy that question, stick it in GPT, and spit back out the answer. And GPT was making up spec for Argo that didn't exist. And it was like, well, obviously that's not working. But, to me, it seems similar with any technology, where even with Google, what you were saying about like, hey, you got to verify that information. I think, you got to do that with Google. Like, you got to do that with Wikipedia. Like, you have to actually like look, like you have to dig a little bit to try to figure out, this stuff, because it's not always clear anyway. And most people, when they search Google, they search for, is my assumption true? Scroll, found an answer that says yes, done, right? I mean, it's confirmation bias all day anyway. So I don't know.
Yeah, but people are kind of just like implicitly trusting ChatGPT where they shouldn't. Whereas like you can trust Wikipedia a lot further than you can trust ChatGPT. Wikipedia has a veritable army of nerds who are making sure that everything that's written on there is like documented as true, right? ChatGPT doesn't have that, and people are implicitly trusting it. And
I do like Wikipedia has the talk page where you can go in and you can see all of the
there's some
super
drama
angry
in there
debates
too.
going on about like little things, and you're like, oh, okay, so there's some
Yeah,
debate
it's
about
really
this, but
fun
maybe
to
they're
watch them
crazy,
argue.
who knows?
Yeah,
it is a
but
challenge.
with Grand Theft Auto as a comparison, like, yeah, you can choose your own adventure, but ChatGPT is there need to be guardrails in place, right? Like, you can't assume that everyone has good intent, especially when it comes to computers. So I think there need to be more guardrails in place, and also there's like a question about ownership of its output that becomes a little bit hairy, and I don't know how long it's going to take for various world governments to shake that one out.
Well, if history is a teacher, then whoever can take most advantage of the new technology will win.
Probably, yeah.
I was reading, I mean, on a side note, like, you know, and this is dangerous territory because we're getting into history conversations, and I'm not a historian, and I don't really know, that much. But
got Google.
I was reading a story that when people first started making steel in China, that it was like poor people that were making it. Like, it was like these merchants. They were the wrong class of people, and it was getting them too much power. And so the government just came in and said, we're just not going to make steel. And that was like worked really well for their society until they encountered civilizations that did make steel. And then it was a big problem, So I don't know if it'll be the same thing with AI, but we'll see.
You still see that happening on a smaller scale with businesses today. For instance, Urban Outfitters is really, they have been accused more than once of seeing like an interesting design from like an individual artist on Etsy, making a very small change and then reproducing it at mass scale. Right. I think Walmart and Target have also been accused of doing that. I don't know whether or not like a lawsuit ever happened, but the accusations are there, and some of them are pretty. If you go look at the thing produced by the big company and the thing produced by the artist years earlier, it's pretty similar. So it still happens for sure. It's a matter of.
But now we can scale it.
Yes, now we can scale it, which we've always been trying to do. I think every change every leap we've ever had in computing, whether it was like the way we interact with computers or the invention of a certain class of tool or the cracking of some particularly difficult decades-long issue, has been a result of we need to scale, we need to be able to do this thing, and we need to be able to do more of it faster. Right? Yeah. Every time we have done something revolutionary and new in computing, it's been a result of that, which is why I don't like scale as a word in like technical marketing copy, because it doesn't have a hard and fast definition, right? When you said scale 15 years ago, that meant something very different than it means today, right? So I don't like particularly useful as a term, but I understand the need for it. People understand what it means. It's just very contextual, right? It can't ever be scale as a word cannot be evergreen.
Yeah,
because our definition of what is at scale is always growing.
Yeah, I mean, scale 100 years ago might have meant that you could serve 100 customers, whereas now we think of scale as maybe it's 1 million customers, or maybe it's billion customers, or you're right. I mean, it doesn't have a definition around it.
No, the first computers you could only interact with using reels of paper, right? Punch cards, and they could only run programs sequentially and only one at a time, right? Like you couldn't like queue up a second job to run after the end of the first one. You had to take your printed output from the first job and then run cards for the second job. We didn't get the ability to like queue up multiple sequential jobs until like the mid 60s, early 70s. So even that has changed. Computer used to only be able to do one single, very simple thing at a time. It was basically just a big computer. We didn't get concurrency until the 70s. So
right. Yeah, so the scale has changed, and actually that is a nice kind of pull us back a little bit into this CI/CD discussion, which is the question of scale. And one of the things that I've seen, and this is kind of a big CodeFresh thing that we talk about, is the proliferation of microservices being a challenge for CI/CD, because when you only had one or two services you needed to manage, you had one or two pipelines. You had a pipeline for each service.
Sure.
But once you have like 5,000 microservices, should you actually be using 5,000 pipelines? Should you be using a shared pipeline? Because most of they're doing the same thing, right? Like you're checking out code, you're building an artifact, you're testing it, you're pushing that somewhere.
Yeah.
They're kind of the same if you can template them out. In your history of CI/CD, is that a reoccurring theme, this templatization? Maybe that's too specific and esoteric of a question.
Yes, in that the first attempt at this was just a way to templatize doing it every day, right? Like once a day or once a week. And at the time, it was just like one pipeline, right? But it was one pipeline replacing doing the same thing once a day or even once a week. Like it's always been an attempt to create a template for something that a human was doing manually. In the case of moving things to a shared pipeline today, rather than having 500 pipelines, it's replacing creating the pipelines, right? So instead of a person creating 500 pipelines, we're templating that down to, one or two or three pipelines. So it's still templating. It's just templating something different than we were templating in 1996.
Yeah. Well, and it reminds me of people used to use, and I don't know if this is still, I'm sure it is still something that people are using, but got a little visitor, sorry.
It's okay.
But people are using like those version switchers where they're like, oh, I'm using Ruby, but I need to have like this environment management switch in my VM that's going to set the right version all the time. And that's always been kind of like that's like something you need to do because you're not using containers, right?
Yep.
And it would be better, like you'd probably be better off just using containers, because then not only could you do all the different versions, you could do them all at the same time, and you could schedule them out across a scheduler, and you could have them use multiple nodes, and it would be faster and easier to work with. And you'll run into fewer issues, and you can specify your versions, and you rock and roll, and you'd be a lot better off if you were doing something.
Just chuck it in a container. There's so much more you can control when you just chuck it in a container.
Right. It's a big problem solver. Well, so now we've talked a lot about the history of CI/CD. What about the future? It sounds like you don't envision any big form changing. It's like the PlayStation controller. It's going to look kind of the same. Do you see big changes happening in the future from a CI/CD perspective?
I do believe that we have nailed the form factor for sure. I don't think that we're gonna change from, I have a set of steps I would like to automate with respect to my pipeline. Here are the steps I would like you to handle for me. I think that the way we define those steps is going to continue to become more abstract. I think more things will just end up being handled out of the box rather than having to define like manually define any kind of connection to something like an artifact repository or whatever. It is simply there. And I think it's been pretty clear that we're moving in that direction for quite a while, considering the number of integrations that everybody and their mother has with every other tool on the market. Defining the steps that we do have to define and making them easier to write, more intuitive to write, is something I think we can continue to see some improvement on. there's going to continue to be a fight over whether imperative or declarative is the way to go there. I don't see that argument ending anytime soon, really.
It does seem like the biggest change that's happened, and I'm totally biased on this, so you can completely say, actually, Dan, that might just be your own little world, but GitOps feels like the biggest thing to change, because having an active controller, monitoring state, reconciling state, having the ability to set up kind of a policy for your application of how it's updated and how it can be out of sync and that kind of stuff. And that feels like a really big shift to me. And for our users, it's like, oh yeah, I want that. That's a better way to be deploying than me building pipelines. And if you think about what that really means, it almost is like a pipeline, but it's one pipeline that is monitoring sources of truth, reapplying those state. That feels revolutionary to me. Am I just in my own little world, do you think? Or is that follow? You are on GitOps the Planet. Don't let that
I am on GitOps the Planet. I am on GitOps the Planet. And I have been on a podcast with you once before, like 4 years ago, where I said that I didn't necessarily think that GitOps was like the future.
Yeah.
Right.
I don't remember that, but maybe that's why we haven't had you on in 4 years.
Oh, it was me and Kit Merker, and it was a thing for KubeCon.
Oh, okay. Yeah. It was the hallway track. I think we did a little show. Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
It was
Windows virtual KubeCons. Yeah.
Yeah. And I don't think I hold the same position anymore. My thing, I think it is the name that kind of doesn't do it for me as an actual like concept. No, I do agree. I think it is rad as hell. In my brain, I put it in the same bucket as CI/CD, but better. It's just like an evolution of CI/CD to me.
Yeah.
Like clearly, this is absolutely the way we should be doing things, right? It abstracts away stuff that I think is annoying, that just about everybody has to deal with. So why not abstract these things away? It makes things more repeatable. You understand more accurately what is actually going on. So no, I do agree. It is great. I just think that the name is not doing it for me. Because it really just feels like an extension of CI/CD to me, which isn't a bad thing. Like that's a good thing. That's what it should be, I think.
We should have called it Git CD, maybe.
Maybe. Yeah.
Because
that's it is grown up CI/CD. CI/CD grew up, and that's what it is now.
Yeah, it does. I mean, as far as X ops, DevOps, sheet ops, data ops, I think the instinct is, I hear a new buzzword, I'm probably going to write it off as just a fad and marketing nonsense. And you're right, 95% of the time. I mean,
95% of the time,
it's not a bad stance to have.
In this case, from like a portmanteau technical perspective, I think GitOps makes way more sense than a lot of the ones you hear out there. Yeah. Like I saw biz dev ops once and I wanted to scream. I know.
Biz dev ops?
Biz dev ops. And there's absolutely an argument. It's that one is absurd. That one is just like, there's no reason for that one. Some of them I understand why people use it, and I don't like immediately want to throw up in my mouth anymore when I hear them. But like shared context is important. It makes it easier to explain things. It makes it easier to get your point across when you're trying to make somebody understand a new tool or a new concept. And generally, most people in our industry know what DevOps is, right? So it's, I think, okay from the perspective of borrowing the context of what DevOps is to explain something like FinOps. That's okay. But once you start doing stuff like biz dev ops,
quit trying to make fetch happen.
Yeah, quit. Yeah, exactly. Quit trying to make fetch happen. It's not going to happen. Stop. It's not cute. It's not cute. And it doesn't actually make anything easier to understand at that point. It's just latching on to what you perceive as a fad to create a new buzzword.
And from a historical perspective, so to think about the technology here, I've had some discussions with folks on Twitter who were sort of hostile early on to GitOps because they said, you have an active agent monitoring state and reapplying, and they were saying I was doing that in the 90s, and I said that's super cool, and you are like some kind of amazing third tier guru who like lives in the Himalayas and speaks from on high. You're an amazing ninja dojo, whatever, that you've been doing this for 20 years. 99% of people weren't skilled enough to pull off what apparently you were doing in the 90s. And I'm not going to question and say you weren't doing it. That's fine. You say you were doing it. I believe you. But making it accessible so that everybody can do it.
Yeah.
That feels like something really important to just
that is the achievement, right?
Yeah.
Like that's, yes, making it accessible, making it so that other people can use it and understand it and benefit from it, like at scale. That's the thing we want to do. Like, I don't care if some nerd managed through grueling hours of trial and tribulation and decades of pre-existing experience managed to do it by hand, one thing in 1993. Yes, CF Engine was released in 1993, but that is a CI/CD tool, or not a CI/CD tool. It's infrastructure as code tool. But yeah, like it's a different accomplishment, right? Good for you.
Cool. Don't get me wrong. Like, I'm impressed. Like, there was a guy who built a car in his garage before Henry Ford, and he was like, check out this thing I built. And it's like, that is amazing. And then somebody figured out how to productize it, and then we all got to have cars. So that was nice, So
yeah, the invention of the assembly line is what got us all cars, not the invention of the car
per se. Yeah.
Right?
Made it accessible, right? So
yeah,
that's what I feel like with GitOps. It's like, the good thing about it is that a lot of these ideas are tried and tested, and they go back 20 years. But the implementation now has learned from all of that, and we're able to provide something easy and turnkey and ready to go. I do want to come to Waleed's question. So he says, the challenge now is, what are you going to manage and how? Customize, Helm, Caravelle, Timony. I haven't heard of Timony. How do you simplify and abstract day two and day-to-day operations? I think this is a real problem for sure.
It is absolutely a huge problem. And every time I look at like the CNCF landscape, it stresses me out, because how does somebody get started, right? How do you decide which of those things you're going to use in the first place before you even figure out like how to manage them? How do you pick, and that is not really something that somebody has solved yet. We're seeing a lot of like platform as a service companies pop up. You see the DevOps is dead people popping up, and I think they're trying to solve that problem for sure. But for now, it's kind of just you pay somebody who's an expert. You hire an expert and let them make that decision for you.
There's always going to be pain, and Helm solves a lot of problems.
It sure does.
But there are some situations where, gosh, customize sure is nice. Really makes my life a lot easier. And somebody looked at both those solutions and said, actually, I think we could do it better in their Caravelle. And there's everybody looks in this standard and they say, I just wish this would do X. And they say, it's not going to do X. And they say, well, I've got a new standard then that does X. And so you get a new standard and it proliferates. And I don't think it's a problem. I think choice is a great thing.
Choice is a good thing. And part of this seeming so messy and difficult now, I think, is a result of how young Kubernetes is and how young this ecosystem is. Like, it is kind of still a free-for-all. Yeah. We're still figuring out what bothers us, right? Besides just reduce complexity, we're still figuring out like what we want to fix, what features we want long-term, what this ecosystem might look like 5 years from now, right about 10 years from now. It's just all still moving so incredibly fast.
Yeah.
That it feels hard.
This is why, and to Waleed's point about like the different config management tools, this is why in Argo we architected it so that it was basically config management was a pass through. It wasn't something that it was like you have a config management plugin, it generates manifests, we apply the manifests. You generate them however you want. And the great thing is that means that, hey, you want to support Helm, you want to support Customize, you want to support your own tool, and you want to invent your own tool, have fun. It'll be great, because at the end of the day, Argo CD is just going to deal with manifests that are rendered. So that is a nice flexible approach. But on the flip side, it's meant that Helm, you can't do lookups. For example, Helm value lookups, which also is kind of a security benefit. So
it is, but I don't know. I really like the plugging stuff into other stuff approach that a lot of tools are taking today. I take Argo CD, and I would also like to use Terraform or whatever other tools that I would like to plug directly into it. I just can, rather than having to, for instance, write my own connector to another tool of my choice. I don't like having to do that. I'm glad I haven't had to do that in a long time for any type of tool. There is often these days just a button you press or just a config option, a flag that you set. That's great. That is great, because it allows people to stay in the ecosystems that they're comfortable with, and still move to your thing.
Yeah. This is something that we've done, going back to Jenkins, where we have a lot of users who come to us and they're like, hey, I've got 10,000 Jenkins pipelines. Woo! I don't really want to migrate them. Can I still use your GitOps stuff? And we're like, you know what? We're just going to integrate with that so you can just still get all the benefits. If you got to stay on Jenkins, we're not going to, whatever. That's fine. You do you. You can still do all the GitOps stuff, and you can get all the insights from your CI exposed in these dashboards and stuff. Because ultimately, it's like, I don't really want to tell people that they have to move. I want them to be excited to adopt something that's going to make them more productive, and not thinking like, oh, how do I move all this legacy stuff? It's like, look, we'll support your legacy stuff, and when you see the advantage of updating that, then you can do it. And until you see it, I'm not going to try to beat you over the head with why you should do it.
Yeah, and just from a marketing perspective, I don't think it's ever a smart move with respect to competitors to try to force people to move over or to be too aggressive about it. I think that is almost always a worse choice. It's less likely to work. And it just kind of makes you look petty.
Desperate.
Right? Yeah, desperate, especially if you do it in public, because then it alienates not just that one person, it alienates absolutely everybody else who's watching. And unfortunately, you see companies doing this kind of stuff all the time. And every time I see it, I mentally file it away as, okay, I'm never going to work with that company or touch that tool, because that's not behavior that I would like to encourage. Especially not in open source. That's just not.
We try to be collaborative, try to be positive.
Right. When I worked at Pulumi, I did stuff with Terraform's developer advocates a couple of times, and that should never be an issue, because are our employers competing? Yes, absolutely. But we both would like people to do infrastructure better and more reliably and more repeatably. Right now, working for Dell, I don't really have an opportunity to collaborate with competitors. I don't know any DevRel at HP, so Portworx. So I'm not really sure how I could do that there. But
well, it is it's one of those things where Christian Hernandez and I have talked a lot about this, where it's like, hey man, there's a pie that we're trying to slice up, but if we focus on growing the pie, we'll probably be way more successful. And I think Microsoft has done this really well over the last 10 years. They've really been collaboration oriented, developer oriented, and it's redounded to their benefit. They've become a lot more popular. VS Code now is is like Bomber. Everybody loves it. It's baked into GitHub now, and it's worked well for them.
Yeah, I mean, and it's it's more DevOps, right? Like DevOps isn't just like tools, right? And any DevOps practitioner will find an opportunity to scream at you that DevOps is not just a tool set, it's a methodology, it's a culture, right? And it's true, but that culture has to be something that you practice not just like at your own company when you are at work. That should inform the way you interact with like the rest of the community, the rest of the industry. You know, like I would, just like at work, I behave a certain way so that we all do our jobs better and faster. I do that in the community as well, so that like the community itself can grow better and faster. And then
Yeah.
other people benefit for it because we're cutting a Kubernetes release faster and more smoothly than we ever have before.
Absolutely. I think I couldn't have said it better myself. Well said, Kat. So I think as we round out, you know, we're a little over an hour now, and as we round out the discussion, what things do you have coming up that you want to plug? Anything you want to call out that's exciting going on? People should follow you on Twitter. Obviously, we've got your name there.
Thank you. Yeah, you can follow me on Twitter. This is live. So currently I'm in Berlin at the We Are Developers Conference. If you are around, you can come say hi. I will be here all week. The next conferences I have coming up are DevOps Day Chicago. I will be there the whole time. I will also be at KubeCon North America in Chicago, the Open Source Summit Europe in Bilbao, and probably DevOps Days Oslo. So if you are at any of those things this year, come say hi.
All right. Well, you heard it. Kat's going to be basically everywhere. So especially if you're in Europe, but she'll be in the US a little bit. So obviously follow her on Twitter. She's got great takes. She's very funny. She's got a good sardonic sense of humor, and she's always got a good joke going on. So I always appreciate that, Kat, about you.
Thank you.
So with that, we're going to say goodbye to Kat. Thank you so much for joining us, and good luck at the show in Berlin.
Thank you.
So moving to the end here, thanks everybody for joining. As always, don't forget to join us next week, where we'll have Kit Merker on, a little reunion, since we were talking about Kit, to talk about creating service level objectives and how this helps teams be more efficient and more effective. I know that we actually use this at CodeFresh with our engineering teams, and they found it very helpful to create an error budget. So we're going to be talking about that. And as always, if you haven't yet become a GitOps champion, become a GitOps champion. We have this amazing program. We have this fantastic community on Discord of GitOps champions, a few thousand strong. And the way that you get an invite is you sign up for GitOps certification. So you go to learning.codefresh.io, get your GitOps certification, learn how to use Argo. It is the most popular, fastest growing, best reviewed GitOps certification on the planet, and it's not even close. So if you haven't done it yet, go to learning.codefresh.io, try it out, and you won't be disappointed. It's fantastic. It's really, really quite excellent. And as always, we'll see you on social media. We'll see you on Twitter. We'll see you on LinkedIn. Thanks everybody for joining, and thanks everybody for your comments. Waleed, always appreciated. Everybody have a great week. Thank you so much.